Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. Good to have you with us today. I want to tackle, I think, a very, very important issue that unfortunately seems to have kind of pushed to the back burner a little bit. And that's Alberta and separatism and referenda and things of this nature. And I know because of the budget and the stuff that's been going on and the craziness in Ottawa, we've kind of got sidetracked, but not so in Alberta. There is a process that is already in place and is moving along through the court system right now. So for those, and many of you have contacted us over the last little while and said, you talk about this. Are these guys serious? Is this really going to happen? Well, to shed some light on this, we are so pleased to welcome back to the podcast our good friend Markham Hislop from Energy Media, who has written extensively on this. Markham, first of all, great to have you with us again. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me, Bill. I always enjoy our conversations.
As do I. And I know oftentimes it's energy centric, and well, this sort of is too, because you can't really separate a lot of these issues. They're so intertwined. But let me talk about the Alberta separation and what Danielle Smith is trying to do, or what some people contend she's not at all trying to do, but simply trying to ride the wave. We'll talk about that in a second too. But to put this in context, before we start talking about the legalities of this and who the players are, there's an interesting piece that I know you're going to publish later on today that I think laser focuses the issue here, not just with the Alberta situation, but with what's going on in the States and frankly in other jurisdictions too. It's called libertarian-authoritarianism. Now, as you mentioned in the piece, at first glance, somebody hears that and they're going to think, well, that's an oxymoron. You can't have both. No, it's not. Maybe explain exactly. We'll get to that, and then we'll get to how it applies to what's going on in Alberta.
Well, one of the things I've tried to do is not just report on what's going on in Alberta, around the oil and gas industry, and we do some political reporting as well, but to explain it. That's the thing, is to really understand what's happening and where things are going. So I ran across a professor from the University of Texas, Austin, and named Patricia Roberts Miller. And so I had Trish on my podcast, and since then I've read some of her pieces, and she writes about American authoritarian libertarianism. And the best way to understand that, or to explain that contradiction that you just mentioned, Bill, is Henry Ford's aphorism. You can have your car in any color you want as long as it's black. You can have your freedom you can have as much freedom as you want as long as it agrees with our definition of freedom. And if you go out, if you color outside the lines and your freedom, doesn't correspond with our freedom, then we will punish you. We will use the power of government, the power of the state, to punish you for that. And so it's this weird combination that I think is very unique to the United States. And one of her points was, this is, in the last 400 years, it pops up all the time. Yeah. And McCarthyism in the 1950s, the Red Scare and Senator Joe McCarthy, and the anti-American House Committee and all of that, she says that's an example of it. But it pops up, periodically during periods of great disruption. And what Canadians have to understand is that Danielle Smith is an authoritarian libertarian. There's no question now that that's what she is. And there are direct links between Donald Trump's MAGA movement and her United Conservative Party and its government.
And that's an important point, because I know there are some people that are suggesting, well, she's just really, repeating and doing whatever Trump says. And I guess maybe there is an argument to be made about that. But as you mentioned, no, there's a playbook that's been in play for a long, long time, for generations, really. I mean, I read an interesting essay some weeks ago about witch burning, back in the old days. And they said that, they were not witches. What they were strong women who were trying to assert themselves. And all of a sudden, the powers that be said, no, they're evil. They're witches. They need to be, they had to get rid of them. They must be murdered. And it was an interesting concept when you put that in context and say, yeah, when you have this mindset, this libertarian authoritarianism, anybody who is outside those lines is an enemy. There's no gray area as far as they're concerned, is there?
No, and it's really interesting. I mean, Danielle Smith's been around a long time. I mean, she was an
Yeah.
editorial writer at the Calgary Daily Herald. She was the leader of the Wild Rose Party, which is very much MAGA oriented, always has been.
Yeah.
And then after she lost her seat in the 2015 election, yes, then she became a radio talk show host. And and I remember one time I wrote a book called The New Alberta Advantage, Oil Sands Technology Policy and Technology Policy and anyway, about the oil sands. I can't even remember the name of my own title of my own book. But anyway, the point was Danielle Smith had me on her show to talk about it, and afterwards we had a chance to chat. And she said, "Well, Markham, my audience has always been and always will be the Wild Rose, which is kind of that very ultra conservative, authoritarian, libertarian part of the Alberta political spectrum." And so she's been at this for a long time, and she's learned from Donald Trump. When I lived in Calgary from 2000 to 2010, I got to know a lot of those people. And they would tell me about the Republican consulting firms, the institutes that would come up from Virginia or Washington to hold seminars and train these folks in the way they talked about the influence of the moral majority and focus on the family and so on their thinking. There's a very, very deep strain. I mean, remember, Bible Bill Aberhart, was premier after 1935, and he, that's where there are deep roots in Alberta for this stuff. So that's all context around the issue that I know you want to talk about.
When the Wild Rose Party, maybe fall a little favor is not the exact phrase, but I mean, obviously she was without a job for a period of time. And you mentioned in the piece here, she got into talk radio. Now, that's my wheelhouse, of course. I did that for years and years and years. And you used some descriptives here that I thought were so apropos because I know the people that did it while I was doing it. The low-hanging fruit when you're doing talk radio is to be confrontational and to pick winners and losers and be black and white. You want outrage. Outrage sells talk radio. At least that's what some people thought. They thought these people don't want to think. They don't want to be educated. They want to anger. They want to vent their anger. And I listened to an awful lot of the stuff she did when she was on the radio in Calgary, and she played the game very well. And that put her in good stead for what she's trying to do right now. Get them angry. Show them that these people here that disagree with you are your enemy. They're not just great people that may have a difference of opinion. They're the bad guys. And that's one of the key elements of authoritarianism and, well, this libertarian authoritarianism that you talk about, isn't it?
Well, and it's a hallmark of populism, right? I mean, this has been around for a long, long time. It goes back to the 19th century at the very least, where populists rally the people. There's some kind of a threat. It might be, I mean, Germany in the 20s and 30s is usually used as an example of this, where after the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, France and the United States, the Allies imposed conditions on the Germans that drove up inflation to incredible rates, and people were hungry, and they would go buy a loaf of bread with a wheelbarrow full of Deutschmarks, that kind of thing, and that created the groundwork for Hitler and his party to rise as populists. Now, we're the people are being we're the victims of Allied aggression. We're being oppressed, and then it became the Jews and became other groups and gypsies and communists. But those were the roots of it were in the sense of us versus them. That's a very important part of it.
Yeah.
Because, people wonder why Danielle Smith fights with first Justin Trudeau and then now Mark Carney and Ottawa. It's because she needs an enemy. And before her, Premier Jason Kenney did the same thing, UCP Premier. And so that's a key part of authoritarian libertarianism is you got to have an enemy to rally folks around, very black and white, us versus them.
As I was reading your piece, I was reminded of when Barack Obama was running for president the first time. Of course, he was running against John McCain, the late John McCain. And that classic element that has burned in my memory, and I think hopefully many people's memories, when McCain was doing a Q&A with an audience at one of the debates, and some lady got up there and accused Obama of being a Muslim, and he was this and that, and McCain actually stopped right there and said, no, you're wrong. He is not he's a good man. We disagree. And he put what I thought was a very cogent argument there. That's old news now. That's the old Republican Party. The new Republican Party, who adhere to the theory we're talking about here, would have said, "You're right. He is evil." And so, in other words, I don't need to plant rage in you. You've already got it. I'm going to fan the flames here, and that's what obviously the Trump people do. That's what the MAGA people do. But that's part of Danielle Smith's playbook here, isn't it?
Oh, in a big way. And here's one of the problems for Eastern Canadians. You have like Ontario, for example, where you're based, you have a strong tradition of progressive conservative governments.
Yeah.
Going back for decades and decades and decades. And you can argue that Doug Ford, whatever you think about him, good or bad, you can see him in the tradition of Bill Davis and
Yep.
other PC
Yep.
premiers, right? He's not a big departure. And so I would imagine that most Ontarians looking at Alberta view Danielle Smith, because she calls herself a conservative, they view her through that lens, that progressive conservative lens,
Mhm.
and they go, that doesn't make any sense. This does, how do I understand what she's doing? Because she's not like this, but that would lead to confusion. And you only understand it when you realize that the libertarian authoritarians, dating back like into 1990s and with the Reform Party, sort of took over the Conservative Party. So they from the inside, and I watched this happen in Alberta because I knew a lot of the progressive conservative staffers and activists and people associated with the party. And when Jason Kenney created the UCP in 2017, 2018, he kicked all of those people out. He kicked them out of the party, and you only had two choices. One, you could leave, or two, you could adopt this new brand of MAGA-style politics that Kenney brought along. And a lot of the people that I knew, in fact, did do that because that was their career they were talking about. So they moved over, but some didn't. And those folks have told me about how they have been alienated. They've been pushed out to the margins. They're not allowed, they're just not welcome in the UCP because they've remade it in this libertarian authoritarian kind of mentality.
And Kenny really kind of learned that from his boss, his old boss, Stephen Harper. I mean, I know you've written about this in the past too. The supposed amalgamation of the Reform Party and the Progressive Conservative Party on the federal level. And promises were made, and they became the Conservative Party. It was not an amalgamation at all. They swallowed the Conservative Party. It's really the Reform Party under a different name. And you're right. A few of the people that were at that convention or those conferences felt betrayed. David Archer's one that comes to mind, an MP that said, "Wait a second, Mr. Harper, you promised us this, and this, and yeah. Well, that was then. This is now. You're either with us or against us." And that seemed to be the attitude. So I mean, the die was cast then, and it's in the mind of the people like Smith and even Jason Kenney before her, that's the playbook. It's us versus them, my way or no way, isn't it?
Well, it is. And now imagine, why does Danielle Smith champion the oil and gas industry as strongly as she does? Because this is an important part of Alberta grievance politics. There's always been a strain in the oil and gas industry that resented Ottawa, particularly over the Pierre Trudeau's imposition of the National Energy Program. And I had a lawyer one time years ago in Calgary, and he had been started his life as a geologist working in the oil and gas industry, then became an oil and gas lawyer. He hated everything Trudeau. He talked. I mean, it was just like they were the worst thing on the planet. And so that's a really important point to understand is how the oil and gas industry is frustrated. These are, in the Canadian context, masters of the universe. Canada is the fourth largest oil producer in the world, the fifth largest gas producer in the world. When Danielle Smith says she wants to double Alberta oil production from 4 million barrels a day to 8 million barrels a day, that puts Canada at the same level as Russia and Saudi Arabia, who are 2 and 3 behind the United States right now. That's the industry looks at the world and goes, we can produce, we have the resource, we can produce it cheaply enough. The only problem we have is we can't get it to market because those damn elites and Laurentian elites in Eastern Canada don't want us to. for whatever reason, climate, environment, whatever it is. And they're so frustrated. And so there's a lot of oil and gas money that has gone in to support Danielle Smith, who used to be an oil and gas lobbyist, by the way, before she
Yeah.
became premier, which is hilarious, the irony. But anyway, so to support her, to support this movement, to support the separatist movement, all of these kinds of movements have a tremendous amount of oil and gas money. And I don't mean that the companies themselves are bankrolling it. I mean the retired CEOs and the vice presidents and the executives. There's a lot of money in Calgary, I tell you. Madeline has lived there. When you go out into some of these more affluent neighborhoods, that's what's bankrolling it. And it's because of that frustrated ambition, and they're not allowed to be what they could be.
What's interesting about that, and you've talked about this in some of your shows in the past too, is I guess one way to really score points with the public when you're trying to advocate and push this agenda forward is, first, as you mentioned, you have to make an enemy, and well, that was easy enough to do. The other thing is you have to create this fear. It's funny. One of my favorite authors is Louise Penny, the great Canadian author, the Gamache books, and she's got a new one out. There's a little ad for you, Louise. But there's a line that she used there because they're talking about, actually, the book she just wrote was about terrorism. And the hero there, the Gamache, the defective, is talking about, how you win people over and how you convince them. He says, fact has been replaced by fear. And that's really the mantra for what these people are doing, isn't it? Make them fearful. Tell them, in the case of Alberta, I think it's something like 85 or 86% of the people in that city, area, that whole province, identify as oil and gas. That's their mainstay. That's their livelihood. That's who they are. Alberta is oil and gas. So you get a Danielle Smith that goes up there and says, they're trying to take it away from you. That's what they're doing. They're taking away your livelihood. They're taking away your identity. Well, that's going to resonate with an awful lot of people, isn't it?
I've interviewed two pollsters. Dr. Jared Wesley is a political scientist at the University of Alberta and polls regularly. And he talks about how his data, like they would take a focus group and they would say, draw a picture of an average Albertan. And they only fell into three categories: a farmer, a rancher, or an oil rig worker. And more often it was the oil rig worker. And Janet Brown, who's a very respected Calgary-based researcher, has been doing this for years. She said, over 50% of all Albertans identify so strongly with oil and gas that an attack on the oil and gas industry is an attack on their identity. It's exactly what you said, Bill. And so that's a button that Danielle Smith pushes all the time, and her base would be 100% would agree with the issue of identifying with the oil and gas industry.
Fear is a great motivator, isn't it? Especially, it's a very, very effective political tool.
Here's in 2019, I went to a narrative conference. It was a week long, and there was a Dr. Anil Chima from Stanford was there. And he was talking about this because Trump at that time, it was 2019, Trump 1.0 was in its heyday. And he was talking about Trump, and he said, Trump uses fear and negative imagery and all of that kind of language. He said, the only antidote to fear and hate is hope and optimism. But you know what? Fear and hate are easy. Easy. I mean, you can go on a talk show, or you can go on YouTube, you can go whatever, and you can push buttons and make people outraged. But to give them hope, to give them optimism, to have that view of that's in very short supply. And so we don't have the antidote that we need to push back against the fear and hate, because we have so few leaders who have a positive, optimistic, hopeful vision for the future.
Well, and again, it comes down to effort, doesn't it? I mean, as you say, the low-hanging fruit is hate. It's easy to cultivate that. To create hope takes a little work, and not everybody seems to want to put the work in, or is not able to. I mean, to be fair, not everybody has that capability. Obama did it for a period of time. We're always looking for somebody, and I guess the Democrats down south are looking for somebody like that now. Good luck with that. But it's much easier. It's much easier to hate, and Trump played on that. They're, these people coming across the border, these Latinos, they're rapists, they're murderers. They let them out of prisons and ship them up here. They're eating our dogs, they're eating our cats. I mean, it's so easy to tap into fear because there's this distrust already that he has tapped into, and we've seen that happen on the Canadian political scene. I'm sure you see stuff as I do almost every day. We don't want to see that happening up here it's already happening in Canada. And when we need to open our eyes to it, because it was happening in the States for years and years, and people said, that's nothing. Those are just a small little portion of people, just like the separatist movement in Alberta. But if you pay no attention to it and let it fester, God knows what's going to happen.
Well, I think, Bill, that the real inflection point here, the political inflection point, was 2020, the rise of COVID and the pandemic.
Yeah.
And, because generally these kinds of extreme political movements, and authoritarian libertarianism fits this perfectly, is that, when things are good and rolling along and, they really they're kind of a fringe movement. We've pushed them back under a rock and we don't see them very often. And this is an important point. I mentioned before, when I lived in Calgary, the progressive conservative governments in Alberta that was a big tent party. And so what they did, part of their genius, was they would bring these social conservatives into the tent and give them give them an ear, give them, they would be part of the party, but they would keep them kind of on a leash. So they didn't cause too much trouble and they were contained. They were co-opted in a way. And that's because after 2020, there was such a disruption and such a big change and so much anger and pushback and conspiracy theories and social media angst and all of that libertarian authoritarianism bubbled up to the fore, and people like Jason Kenney took advantage of it. They tapped into it for political reasons, and then when Danielle Smith became premier in 2022, the conditions were perfect for her style of rhetoric, for her style of political ideology.
What's interesting about this, and again, I know you're going to post this later on today, so people can catch it on Substack, but you ask how do they justify doing this? Because for generations now, we've had rules, we've had guardrails, we've had, laws that okay, you can do that. We try to give you some freedom, but, within these rules, okay? One of the mainstays of this movement, the Trumpism, the MAGA thing, and certainly what's happening in Alberta, is no, the rules don't apply. Because the rules were made by the people that are our enemies. So we don't need to do that. And if we go outside those rules, we're well within our rights to do that because we're fighting the elites and we're fighting for you. It's a bastardization of being rational, but it seems to work for an awful lot of people that say, yeah, you're right. Yeah, those are the enemy. And yeah, you do whatever you need to do to vanquish them and let us do what we want.
It's really interesting. When I was going to university 40 years ago, I was a historian, so I got to study people like John Stuart Mill. The classic definition of liberty and freedom, which goes back to the 18th century, is my freedom stops where your nose begins.
Yeah.
So I'm free to do whatever I want, as long and swing my fists as much as I like. But if I hit you, if I cause you inconvenience, pain, I trample on your rights, that's the end. That's the limit of my freedom. These people don't want to do that. They want a kind of a definition of freedom where it's whatever I want it to be. So I don't want to take a vaccine, and I don't want to wear a mask, and I don't want to, vaccinate my kids against measles. I don't want to do any of those things. But but it's okay for me to impose my definition of freedom on you. That's a really key characteristic of authoritarian libertarianism. You see it in MAGA, in the MAGA culture in the United States, and it's very, very prevalent in Alberta. I'm someone who's been, on December 1st, Bill, Energy Media will be entering its 18th year. We've been doing this a long, long time.
Yeah.
And I've been an active participant in the Alberta energy and political discussions for a long, long time. And I can't tell you how many people have given me this argument, that you're not going to do this to me. You're not going to make me take a vaccine, but I'm going to make you do all of these things because this is my definition of freedom. And if you don't like it, I'll force you to do it. And authoritarian libertarianism is not just alive and well inside the United Conservative Party and with Danielle Smith. Increasingly, it's a part of the political culture in Alberta.
Well, and let's focus on how they're using, or maybe the argument should be abusing, that mindset. Because obviously one of the hallmarks, supposed hallmarks of libertarianism is you live your life as long as you're not harming anybody else, carry on and have a great time. And Daniel Smith's talked along those lines. This is what we want. We want less government. Well, let's wait a second. She has centralized the government in Alberta. They have used the Notwithstanding Clause. What is it? 4 times in the last few months now to bring the teachers back, and transgender rights. Basically, they're forcing their ideology on everybody else. That's not libertarianism. Yet they still want to wear that banner.
Yes, that's exactly right. I've done extensive interviews with political scientists and members of the union movement about the use of the Notwithstanding Clause. And it's not like she's the first premier who's invoked Section 33 of the Constitution. That's in fact, Doug Ford tried it in 2022 and had to back down. But nevertheless, others have occasionally. But it's meant to be a means of last resort, and to be used very, very, very sparingly. And what she's done is and this is the danger that political scientists are flagging, is that she has made it a means of standard political maneuver or action for political convenience. So the 51,000 teachers were striking for 3 weeks, and there was a lot of public support behind them, and they were that support was growing, and so she legislated them back to work, saying that the children and their parents were suffering. And so that she had to end that. She had to bring the teachers back, get the kids back in school, and that justified using the Notwithstanding Clause, which for those folks who don't know, that means that her back to work legislation can't be challenged in court. So there is no recourse for the union, for anybody else to challenge it. And then she turned around and she's now doing it. I can't remember if she's done it or she's about to do it, but on these 3 transgender pieces of legislation. And she's doing it because to save the transgender children under 18 from mutilation and castration and all sorts of horrible things. Well, I had Professor Dwayne Brott from Mount Royal University on my interviewed him a few days ago, and he said she's never brought any evidence forward. And she said the evidence that we do have from the healthcare community is that none of this is happening. Like there is, anything that happens with transgender kids involves the parents by law. Many of the things she's talking about, like bottom type surgery, is already illegal. I mean, she's literally invented this stuff because in her base, the transgender issue, as it is in the MAGA culture in the U.S., is accepted fact. It's a conspiracy theory that's been accepted as fact. And she will actually bring in legislation to change the status quo based on conspiracy theories, and then use the hammer of the Constitution to ram it through and force it on Albertans.
I've done a number of shows in the past about the Notwithstanding Clause. I mean, it was a terrible idea, and it was kind of a throw-in to try to get a few of the provinces to agree to the debate that was going on at the time. I don't even know if the people that threw it in there knew that it was going to be abused to the extent that it's being abused now. I think ostensibly part of the justification was basically to assuage Quebec and say, we're going to help you protect your culture, okay? And now, of course, you've got Alberta saying, no, it's going to justify us sending the teachers back, a thing of this nature. But the mindset, again, that the people within that movement, whether it's the MAGA movement or what's happening in Alberta, is it doesn't matter what the rules are, because as we say, it's the elite that are making the rules, and we're against the elite. But you've lived there, you've studied this extensively. When we hear about this and we see she's in office, and we're hearing they're the loud voice. This is not the majority of Albertans, though, is it? This is a small, I know it sounds like a cliche, a small but very vocal group, but they're controlling the narrative right now.
Oh, that's absolutely the case. So let's talk about separatism, where she's brought in the Sovereignty Act to try to
Yeah.
take powers away from the federal government. She has played footsie with the separatist movement in Alberta ever since she became premier in 2022, and she regularly showcases them, and that she has separatists in her caucus, which is obviously a political problem for her. But the thing is that separatism only has the support of 15 to 20% of Albertans, according to polls. There is no support for it. But they are a very loud minority. Now, here's an interesting point. She brought in, they have referendum legislation, and you'll have to forgive me, Bill, if I don't get the technical details exactly right. It's a bit complicated. But there's a process for getting signatures on a petition that could then put a question on a referendum during an election or anytime the government decides. And so Premier Smith brought in changes to that act to make it easier. And
She lowered the threshold.
She lowered the threshold. But what she didn't count on was Thomas Lukaszuk, who was the deputy premier under PC Premier Alison Redford, and who now has been very quietly off the grid for a long time. And he came back and he said, you know what? That legislation hasn't been enacted yet. It hasn't been proclaimed and isn't law. He said, I'm going to go under the old legislation, which actually had a higher threshold, and I'm going to preempt the separatists, and I'm going to register with Elections Alberta, and a better question, his question is very simple. Should Alberta remain as a province of Canada or remain as a part of Canada? Very clear. Whereas the separatists were talking about making it all fuzzy and confusing and so on. So what he did, he needed, 293,000 signatures. He started the Forever Canadian movement, and in 3 months, they got almost 500,000 signatures. And it became, as he said himself, I just interviewed him a couple of days ago. He said they were shocked. It went from being a pushback against separatism to becoming a movement of Albertans who love Canada and wanted to proclaim their Canadianness and their allegiance to Canada and not separatism. And it's been, now there's recall campaigns, up to maybe 25 of them that are in the process to recall UCP MLAs. They're beginning to be a backlash and using some of Smith's own legislative tools, which is kind of amusing.
To be sure, though, and there's some question, and I know I've read some pieces too that they're wondering whether or not Danielle Smith is being rather ambiguous when it comes to separation. Is it just a tool that she's using, and as you say, a wave she's trying to ride here, if she's sincere about it? But there are those that are adamant about this. The Mitch Silvestris and others within the province. This is their raison d'etre as far as they're concerned. But what I found interesting about this, and you just touched on it in the previous answer there. They're not quite sure what they want. I mean, there's one stream that says, yeah, we want to separate. We want to be our own country altogether. Another one that is suggesting, no, we want to be with the 51st state. We're going to join the United States. Others are suggesting, well, no, you know what? We can talk to Scott Moe and maybe bring Saskatchewan around and maybe even Manitoba and start our own little country within the confines of Canada. They're not really defined on this, but and I don't know if that helps or hurts what they're trying to do. But I don't get the sense that there's any lack of sincerity from those. They just want out altogether. And it's interesting to watch just how this is starting to play out right now. But the key element here, as you talked about, is whether or not there's going to be a referendum. Some are suggesting, yes, it's going to happen because of the signature situation. In 2026, Danielle Smith she hasn't said no. She hasn't said there won't be one. But I know that some folks have done some research on this and say, okay, if she's sincere about this, and if the result were to say, yes, we want out, which is highly unlikely, but it is a possibility, you'd think that the government would be formulating a plan B. You said, okay, what are we going to do from here? And the evidence they have, or the lack of evidence, is that they haven't done anything about this. So you have to wonder about just how dedicated Danielle Smith is to this, or is she just happy that the fact that she can foment this anger within the federal government and say Ottawa's the enemy, we want out. Not the first time that argument's been presented in Alberta. And we've seen it. I mean, there was a movement in BC years ago about this, and certainly Quebec as an example. Even Ontario, there's always people that say we want out of Confederation. That's going to happen. But usually cooler heads and intelligent heads prevail. What's your read on the work you've done on this and the research you've done on this, Markham? Is Danielle Smith just playing this game here, or does she really have some thought that maybe we would be better off? I mean, you look at her association with MAGA. You know, she was down at Mar-a-Lago. As you mentioned, she didn't actually get to the swearing in because of the weather and all that sort of stuff. But she was there. Her and Kevin O'Leary. We've all seen the photos on that. Is this a game she's playing, or is this in her heart of hearts where she thinks Alberta should be going?
Let me tell you a little story, Bill.
Yeah.
When I was an undergraduate at the University of Saskatchewan in Saskatoon in like 1982, 83, the Western Canada Concept Party, which had one MLA in Alberta, came to Saskatoon and did a public presentation at the library. And, you know, I was a student. I thought, well, this is interesting. I'm going to go down there. And I went with my brother-in-law at the time. And we listened to the speech, and it wasn't very inspiring. It was kind of, it had a lot of, you could hear a lot of echoes of that speech in what's going on in Alberta today in the separatist movement. And afterwards I stood up and I asked some questions, and I said, you know, and I made some critiques. And then later on they came up to me and said, oh, Markham, that was great. We'd love you to run for us in the next election. And I went, no, I'm a Canadian. I'm sorry. No, I'm not going to do that. But I'll tell you, Bill, the separatist movement has not progressed from 40 years ago with the Western Canada Concept Party. It's still a bunch of folks who are not very charismatic and not very organized and can't explain their position very well and really appeal to a small percentage of the Alberta electorate, and especially is particularly not popular in the bigger centers like Calgary and Edmonton, which for the most part, I would argue, would control the political culture and the politics in the province. So as a serious, something to take serious, no, I would say it's not. On the other hand, think back to the beginning of our conversation here. You were talking about my essay and this broader concept of authoritarian libertarianism, where you have to have enemies, where you have to have grievance-fueled politics all the time. Then separatism fits very well as one of the tools in the toolkit of that ideology. Now, why isn't Danielle Smith doing more? I can only give you my theory, as because we don't know really. But I think that right now, Carney and Tim Hodgson, the Minister of Energy at the federal level, are giving her enough positive comments and feedback about the possibility of a pipeline to the West Coast that it's not the right time for her to be playing that card, right? She doesn't want to alienate Carney. She's got something going positive, she thinks, that will lead to an MOU here in the next week or two about the pipeline. And so it's don't rock the boat time. And I think that she's going to keep the separatist thing, as well as others, in her back pocket, and wait to see what happens next spring when she brings forward her proposal. Alberta government will be the proponent for a pipeline, and how that's received. So I think that's why she's keeping her powder dry at the moment.
And again, playing the politics of it. But you talked about COVID a second ago, and I want to just swing back to that for a second, if I could, because we all saw what happened there. The truckers thing, such as it was, and a lot of the innuendo that went on there. And it was not a truckers' protest, of course. It was basically a bunch of anarchists that descended on our nation's capital. Had very little to do with that. And you know, one of the strong arguments, of course, was the truckers saying, well, they're forcing us to get vaccines, which they weren't, of course. And it's funny because I, at that time, had a number of people from that industry on. Was it 97% of people in the trucking industry were vaccinated? And said, yeah, that's fine. The reason they couldn't go across the border, because the United States had those limitations in place. It had nothing to do with the federal government or the provincial governments either. But as you say, why let the truth get in the way of a good rant? And that's what they did, and people wanted to do that. So those anarchists, because we see them here in Ontario. When I go back and forth from where we are back down to Hamilton, Toronto area, I pass a house along the way in a little town called Mansfield, and this guy is all in. You know, it's F Trudeau, now it's F Carney. Freedom. I want my freedom. I'm thinking, I have never stopped to talk to him, and I don't plan to. Freedom from what? You can choose not to get vaccinated if you want. what they don't want are consequences to their actions or their decisions. They want to say and do what they want, and we can do that. But if you say you're not going to get this, or if you say you want to go 75 kilometers in a 30-kilometer zone, there are consequences. And that seems to be, that's what their problem is, but they don't want to admit that. They would just want to blame the government for putting those guardrails in place, don't they?
You remember back in the days of the Freedom Convoy, and we had one here in Parksville. It was
Yeah.
funny. My wife and I were going down to, it was 2022. We were going down to the beach to walk our dog and driving along. And all of a sudden, there was like everywhere, there were these vehicles honking their horns, and they had big Canadian flags. And it was exactly these kind of folks. And the point here, I think, is that they have undermined the idea of of community and a collective responsibility, because what they want, as you said, is what they think is freedom. And they would bring up the Charter of Rights and Freedoms all the time, and none of them ever read it, because if they did, the very first section, I think it's actually the first sentence is that rights are not absolute, and they can be prescribed, limited by lawful means. And so one of the rights that can be prescribed is your ability to go out unvaccinated and spread diseases to other members of the community. I mean, that's a restriction on our freedom, that on our individual freedom, that we accept, because it provides communal freedom, community freedom. Our kids don't get sick and die, we don't get sick, and so on. And they reject that very idea because it inconveniences them. They don't want to do that because they believe in, the conspiracy theories around the vaccine or whatever it might be. So that idea I think this is a major problem we've got in Canada, the idea of a commitment to community in addition to individual self. The erosion of community is a major problem in politics, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, we had a version of the rally too in the Hamilton area at the time when I was still doing radio down there, and they had, down around the Queen Elizabeth Way and the Hamilton Toronto Way, there was people, like you say, lining the overpasses and everything. I knew some of them. I'm people that we knew as friends. And I know them that they just hated the Liberals. They hated anything to do with Justin Trudeau or Pierre Trudeau or anybody named Trudeau or anybody that had a red flag on they hated it. So anything to do with government, they were protesting the government. It had nothing at all to do with vaccines, as I mentioned on the show at the time. And I'm sure it's the same, where you in Saskatchewan and later, well, you've lived just about every province out there. Mandates have been in place for the longest time. In Ontario, for instance, and I'm sure it's in vogue in most of the other provinces, school kids have to be vaccinated or they can't go to school. And it's been like that for generations. And one or two parents would complain about it, and they'd say, okay, fine, but they can't go in until this is done, it's fixed. And it was never a big deal. All of a sudden, it's a big deal because these people, these perpetrators of this mindset, said it's a big deal. You've been suppressed. You've been oppressed for this last little while. Don't you see what they're doing to you? Yeah, you're right. Yeah, price of gas is going up. It's because of the vaccines and everything like this. It's easy, as you said a few minutes ago, to foment hate and to get people on side like this. And we, I guess, as a population, to a certain extent, Markham, are to blame for this because we too easily give in to this. It's easy to simply read an editorial or see a posting on social media and say, yeah, you're right. It must be these guys. And it's awfully hard to I guess, counter that sort of mindset. Is there a movement in Alberta? You mentioned that the petition, the counter petition about the separation is really starting to take off right now. You always want to think that, okay, cooler heads are going to prevail here. This is not really going to catch fire. But by the same token, when you look at what's happening down south right now, it just seems as if this is entrenched now in so many people's mindsets. How do you turn this around? And I know we all live in a society right now where we want instant solutions. There's no instant solution to this. And this mindset, this libertarian authoritarianism that we're talking about here, didn't start overnight. It's been going on for generations, and it's grown now. But how do you turn the Titanic around here before it hits the iceberg?
That's a very good question, Bill, and we've grappled with it here at Energy Media, because what we have, and we started doing this during the pandemic, our journalism model is based on expert interviews. And so normally that would be, economists, people in the energy industry, and so on. But what we realized is that model where you get somebody on for 15 minutes or 30 minutes or whatever, and you let the expert talk and explain very complicated issues, and so that your viewers or listeners can understand it. So we turned that on. We used that to explain COVID and the issues like vaccines and public health policy. And we did about 70 interviews with experts all around the world. And it was we did our best to explain complex issues and sort of push back against the convoy crowd and the anti-vax crowd. And that experience convinced me that the only way out of the morass that we find ourselves in now is for people to stand up. And leaders have to stand up. It's no longer okay to be complacent and take for granted the freedoms that we and the democracy that we have built over the last 150 odd years. It's now under attack, and the principles, democratic principles that it's founded on, are under attack. And so I firmly believe, and this is one of the reasons why I'm interviewing experts like Trish Roberts Miller, is what we can bring to the table is understanding, taking complex, confusing issues, putting some structure around it, explaining why things are working the way they do, what the motivation is, how the tools are being wielded by the people like Danielle Smith. And you're starting to see other people like that. This Thomas Lukaszak in Alberta that I was talking about.
Yeah.
Heck, yourself. What's your tagline?
Yeah, stay in touch, stay informed. And the other one that I've used constantly, which I think is very apropos here, don't just listen to what they're saying, watch what they do, because they can they vary so significantly. Oftentimes, we fall for the rhetoric way too often these days because it's easy to, instead of actually watching what they're doing and say, whoa. Danielle Smith is a classic example. Oh, I'm a libertarian. I do live and let live. Let's just, no, it's centralized government. It's the total opposite. And you and I have talked about this in a previous show. It's like what Trump is doing. It's what they call projection. In other words, I'm going to project what I think I want you to think, not what I'm doing. Okay, don't watch it. And hasn't Trump actually even said that? Don't pay attention to what your eyes see. Just listen to what I'm saying. And that's one of the hallmarks of this whole mindset in this movement, isn't it?
It is indeed. And so what I can say is, what we're grappling with here at Energy Media is we've put the effort into trying to understand these complex issues. We're trying to communicate it. And I think we're at the point where, as a journalist, being an activist is a very difficult thing. It's one thing to take editorial positions. Newspapers have done that since George Brown at the Globe, back in the 1850s. There's a long tradition of that. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of what we need now. Is people like you and I need to take editorial positions and say, this is wrong. Here's why it's wrong. Here's what we should be doing instead. And we're not buying this, authoritarian libertarianism anymore. We're not buying the MAGA argument, the anti-vax argument, the, using the Notwithstanding Clause to penalize minority groups, all of that sort of thing, and push back. And once Ralph Klein, I'm not a big Ralph Klein fan, but he said something really smart. He said, politicians don't lead. They find a parade and get out in front of it. And I think that people like you and I, with the audience we have and the powers that we have, we're building already a parade, a pro-democracy parade, a pro-Canada parade that eventually politicians can get in front of. And maybe that's the antidote to people like Danielle Smith.
Where's the tipping point, though? I guess, Markham. That's the thing that I know you and I have wondered about. When do they figure that? I mean, even south of the border. I mean, even Joe Rogan now is starting to question some of the stuff that Trump is doing. A lot of it has to do with the Epstein situation, but a couple of other things. Because once you start down that road, you think, hey, and this thing here too that I thought was okay. No, it's not. Now, I'm not suggesting Rogan is going to change his ideas or mindset about stuff like that, but the fact that all of a sudden there are some cracks in that, and we've seen that happen here. This story comes to mind with me as, and a very good friend of mine who is one of the most prominent talk show hosts in the country for years and years and years, extremely to the right of the political spectrum. And I've known him for many, many years, and he just had what he called an epiphany one day, and it had to do with Jason Kenney, and had to do with conversion therapy and a few things. I'm talking about Charles Adler. I'm sure
Yeah,
many
of course
people
you
know
are.
that.
I
And
knew you were talking about Chuck.
Charles has
Started.
been a good friend of mine for
Yeah,
years, and it's now Senator Charles Adler.
yes.
But he went quite public about this and said, you know what, those have been my politics, but he said it's gone too far. You know, that's a bridge too far, and he just said, you know, no more. And I know he alienated an awful lot of people when he said that, but he had the courage of his convictions. Always has, as far as I've known Charles. But how do you evoke that sort of that courage, really, to make a stand like that? Because you and I both know that there are people doing what we do, people in the you know, the mainstream media. I hate to use that phrase, but you know, the conventional media, that don't have the courage to do that. You know, they don't. They see Stephen Colbert. They go, I don't want to get fired. I don't want to. You know, the people around the Air Force One the other day, you know, when he made that terribly, you know, insulted comment to the girl, you know, shut up, piggy. Where was the outrage there from the other people? There were 15, 20 reporters there. Nobody said anything. You know, who's going to stand up and do that? And it takes courage to do that, and because there are going to be ramifications. And maybe we're thinking, well, geez, do I going to be the one? What if I lose my job? It's difficult, but it's necessary for somebody to stand up and call this out. And do you see that more and more people are moving in that direction now to say maybe enough is enough, and we've just got to take a stand right here?
I think I can put some structure around this question, Bill, because in a couple of interviews ago, we were talking about how clean energy technology traveled along the bottom of an S curve for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And then it reached the inflection point around the curve of the S point where it became competitive with fossil fuel-based technology. It became lower price, higher value. And now it's starting to push like internal combustion engines. Electric vehicles are pushing internal combustion engines out of the market. Slowly, but it's happening. Well, the same principles apply to ideas as much as they do to technologies. So you have the this MAGA-style culture that's become very prominent, and those of us who are pushing back against it, our ideas are coming up to the inflection point, I think. And I don't know when that exactly is going to be. It could be next week, it could be next year, 5 years from now. But as the momentum grows and we get around to that inflection point, then there'll be a break. Something will happen. It'll be a political controversy. It'll be just the volume of voices. It'll be an election, whatever it will be. And that will be the thing that is the breakthrough, is that inflection point. And the question becomes when it is. And I don't know. I don't think any political scientist could tell you. But if there's enough people that get in that parade that we're talking about, that will get us to the inflection point quicker, and we will get back to some kind of democratic, sensible, sane politics that, Canadians have supported for decades.
It's very hard to predict that, obviously, especially when you get to public mindset as to how that's going to happen. I mean, we watched the rather quick ascent of Pierre Poilievre, for instance, a year and a half ago, and figured, well, it's a done deal. He's going to be the next prime minister. He's 23 points ahead in the polls, just months away from the election, and public opinion turned almost. I don't want to say overnight. I mean, there were other factors. Trudeau left and Carney came in. But what that did, I guess, quite aside from the personalities here, it gave those voters an alternative to say, whoa, wait a minute, maybe this is the way to go as opposed to that. And I don't know if that's happening in the States yet. I don't know if it's happening in Alberta. I know Naheed Nenshi would love for it to be happening in Alberta in the next couple of months. He'd love to be the premier. The former mayor of Calgary, of course, is now the leader of the Alberta NDP. But is there an appetite to say maybe there's a better way? Is there enough disenchantment among Albertans right now to look at Danielle Smith and say, we don't want to go down that road before? Because as you mentioned in the piece, that will remind you once again, you're going to put up later today so everyone can read this. People that adhere to this and ride that tiger, that authoritarian, it never ends well. It never has. Whether you're Joe McCarthy, whether you go right down the list in history of people that have done this before, it's usually a pretty ugly end. And I'm not suggesting that's going to happen with Danielle Smith, but at some point, we the public, have to understand that this is not the future. This is a reflection of who we are right now, and we've got to do something about this, and jump off this tiger before it eats us.
Remember Joe McCarthy. What brought Joe McCarthy down? Well, ultimately, it was the fact that Dwight Eisenhower had had enough. And he
Hmm.
began to intervene, and he undermined Joe McCarthy. And that started his slide. And then they elected John F. Kennedy in 1960. And that was the nail in that whole movement's coffin. And let's talk about Naheed Nenshi. I know Naheed. I started interviewing him in 2010 when he ran for his first, the first time he ran for mayor and won. And Naheed is a brilliant guy. I mean,
Yeah.
he's got an MBA from Harvard or someplace, and he worked for McKinsey, and he was a professor, and he's a very, very smart guy, and he's very articulate, and he
And
was
very personable.
yeah, it was,
He's
yes,
very
very
charismatic.
personal. So if there was anybody when he was running for the leadership of the NDP, everybody supported him. He won with a very large margin because they thought that they would get the mayor of Calgary as the leader of the NDP. And for
Yeah.
whatever reason, now this is over a year now, they didn't get that. And I would have to say that he's been a disappointment. And I've taken him to task a number of times on his lack of energy policy. He just doesn't want to grapple with it. And he very often is what I call UCP light. I mean, he just echoes Danielle Smith, which for as a leader of opposition, he shouldn't do, never mind being an NDP. So the question in Alberta would be between now and the next election, can Naheed Nenshi rise to the occasion? Can he be the leader, the government in waiting that Albertans need? Because if he doesn't, then Danielle Smith will probably win the 2027 election, and we'll have, Smith 2.0 or 3.0, and away we go. So in Alberta, there needs to be leaders, and Nenshi is the most obvious candidate, and we'll see if he can do it. He hasn't so far.
Yeah, when I had him on, he was in Hamilton. This is when he was the Calgary mayor, and our focus obviously was municipal reform and things of this nature. And so he came down to address the Chamber of Commerce, and I had him in studio for about an hour, as we're doing. And he's a very impressive guy, and he was the shining light. He was like, "Hey, this is the future. This is how municipalities should run." And he talked about some of the innovations in Calgary, et cetera. But maybe that was his wheelhouse. I don't know, because you're right. He seems to be in the background when it comes to some of the key issues in Alberta right now with energy, but who knows what's going to happen in the next 18 months or so. But similarly, that's what the Democrats down in the States are looking for right now. Who is that person going to be that we can say, okay, this is the change? With Obama, it was pretty easy. There's a guy who was charismatic, a brilliant orator, and words matter, and the way you deliver those words mattered. And he had all the tools. Those people don't come along all the time, though, do they? It's not as if you can just pick, okay, that's going to be the one. They show themselves, and it's pretty hard sometimes for that to happen. And I know the Liberals in Ontario have been looking for one for years and years now. The NDP and in other provinces like this as well. So they don't just grow on trees, but when they come, you know it. The problem is we don't know when they're going to come and in what fashion they're going to show themselves. Whether it's going to be Gavin Newsom, the current governor of California, or somebody else, or up here. To show that there's a better way to do things. And Mark Carney, I guess, filled that role to a certain extent earlier this year with that federal election. Certainly has his work cut out for him right now, but it showed people that no, you don't have to go with that guy that you don't really like anyway. There is an alternative. So I guess that shows us that there is hope here when you look at it that way, Markham, that there is, the good in all of us wants to say, I want to find somebody who can show me the way, lead me that way. We're just looking for who that might be, whether it's to do with the policies in Alberta right now or on the national level or whatever the case might be. So we haven't given up yet, and we're not a lost cause yet. But with the fact that it's going in the direction it's going right now can be awfully frustrating for us until we finally see that shining light. And we thought we've seen this, with some of the other people in Alberta in the last little while. And Danielle Smith, as you say, from time to time, has tried to portray herself as a moderate, as difficult as that might be for some people. I know that it seems oxymoronic to say Danielle Smith and moderate, but she seems to get along with Prime Minister Carney. They seem to have some commonalities when it comes to some of these policies, but it seems as if the support and the camaraderie here is about this wide and about this thick, and you really don't know how long it's going to last.
Bill, I want to make an important point here. When I was in graduate school 40 years ago, I had to take a class called historiography, study of historians. And for my paper, I had to write about Arnold Toynbee, who wrote a book called The Study of History. This bloody thing was 11 volumes long. It was huge. And Arnold Toynbee did world history. Like, this is 100 years ago, right? In the 1930s. The thing that I remember about reading all of those pages is he said, civilizations rise when the leadership meets an existential crisis and succeeds. They rise to the occasion. Civilizations fall when an existential crisis comes along and leadership does not rise to the occasion. And so we are now, in my opinion, in an existential crisis for Canada. We're facing this rise of the, in Alberta, the MAGA political movement, and we're seeing, threats from Trump and annexing Canada and attacking our economy. And this is, I think, one of the big existential moments in Canadian history. Will our leadership rise to the occasion? And I think, Bill, that you and I should define ourselves as part of that leadership that needs to rise to the occasion. And what part of what we will contribute are conversations like this, so that people can
Absolutely.
understand and motivate citizens. So everybody out there, if you're in a position of leadership, rise to the occasion. Step up, defend Canadian principles, engage with the other side if you have to, but more importantly, engage with people like you and motivate them and get them involved.
And history shows, just to put a cherry on top of that, people will follow you. You may not see them, but they will follow. They're waiting for you and you and you to do that, and they will follow. And we've seen that happen historically for hundreds, if not thousands of years through the course of human history, too. Markham, it's always a pleasure having you on the show, and I know we kind of go off into side roads here, but it's so important, I think, for us to have these discussions and for Canadians to have these discussions. Let me remind people once again that the piece that we're talking about here, definition of libertarian-authoritarian, you're going to post later. It's going to be on your Substack, I would think.
Should be in a couple of hours. The Substack is Thoughtful Energy Journalism. In order to read it, you'll have to subscribe to it. My apologies for that, but that's the way the system works. And it'll be about a couple thousand words. Hopefully, it will be an interesting read.
And you can check Markham out, of course, with Energy Media and many YouTube videos, too, about that. Can't wait for our next conversation. Thank you so much again for this today, Markham. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me, Bill, and I look forward to our next chat as well.
You betcha. Markham Hislop, of course, from Energy Media. That's it for this edition of the podcast. For those of you watching on YouTube, thanks so much for being with us. Hit that notification bell for us, would you please? And thanks to all those who are subscribing. We've had a rush of those in the last little while, and we do appreciate your support. Your support through subscriptions, as Markham mentioned, helps us to continue to do the work that we're doing right now, and we really do appreciate that. Thanks, as always, to Madeline Kelly for the great work producing the show today. And until next time, I'm Bill Kelly. Stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.